If you think yourself not only young at heart, but young in legs, but you're sitting, you might consider trading with someone young in heart, but not so young in legs. I apologize, too, for the shortage of chairs. But look around, or if there's a seat untaken, if you would raise your hand, and maybe those still standing could find one. Such manliness calls to mind a captain of a cruise liner. We are assembled to hear a lecture on St. Thomas Aquinas. It is fitting that such a lecture be delivered in the auditorium of the building named after that remarkable saint, one might almost say baptized, 4 years ago. To be sure, in the relatively short period that this space has borne the address 100 Aquinas Hall, it has been the scene of perhaps as many as a dozen formal lectures that were concerned in some way with the thought of St. Thomas. Today's lecture is not just one more in an open-ended series, however. Those who organized this event conceived of it as a particularly fitting way to commemorate the 125th anniversary of the university, the establishment of which was formally approved by Pope Leo XIII in a letter dated April 10th, 1887. In that letter, Aquinas is the only person Leo identifies by name, and he does so twice. So crucial a role in the life of a modern Catholic university and the restoration of learning, as Leo puts it, did the Pope accord to that medieval thinker. It was hardly an accident, then, that the Catholic University of America would enlist the very same person as its sainted patron. What better way to celebrate our institutional birthday, one might suppose, than to attend a lecture dedicated to St. Thomas Aquinas? At this point in the proceedings, I might be expected to direct your gaze toward our lecturer by listing at some length and with the most lavish of praise his many signal qualities and accomplishments. In that way, I would have laid a reliable foundation for a rapid ascent to the predictable conclusion of the standard introductory syllogism. How truly fitting it is, dear friends, and how very privileged we are that, insert here the name, title, and institutional affiliation of the person being introduced, should condescend to speak to us today on this subject, whatever it might be, so dear to our hearts and so apt to the present occasion, you name it, in which he is the undisputed master. If that's the sort of thing you were hoping to hear from me, I fear I must disappoint you. For one thing, many of you here already know him well. He was on the faculty of the School of Philosophy for 11 years, after all. And if you don't, Google will be glad to tell you in less than a heartbeat who he is. For another, an introduction that would recapitulate in glowing terms his undoubtedly very impressive resume would all but compel our speaker to respond in shop-worn fashion by prefacing his lecture with a few self-deprecatory remarks. And since I'm pleased to call him a friend, you must forgive me for wishing to spare him that indignity. Besides, I happen to know that Father Brian Shanley has precious little talent for donning the guise of false modesty. For some reason, he just cannot do it convincingly. Instead of rehearsing a potted biography, then, I shall highlight one single feature of his person that makes him particularly well suited to deliver a lecture from this podium on this august occasion: his great fidelity to the calling within a calling that he received by God's providence when he was offered the opportunity to live his Christian vocation as a Dominican, which is to say, as a member of a religious community founded by another saint, one Dominic Guzman, almost 8 centuries ago. I do not mean to suggest that because our patron saint was a Dominican, and because our lecturer today is also, it follows that our lecturer is uniquely qualified to speak about our patron, much less that our lecturer is a saint. By that line of reasoning, any Coors-soaked Broncos fan picked at random from Mile High Stadium could be expected to deliver an authoritative account of the secret to Tim Tebow's success. Father Shanley is a very accomplished student of Aquinas, it is true, but the letters OP after one's name are not prerequisite to registration in classes taught by Brother Thomas, who has been a doctor or teacher of the Universal Church ever since Pope Pius V so proclaimed him in 1567. What I would call to your attention, rather, is Father Shanley's energetic, exacting, clear-headed, and wholehearted dedication to the life those two letters are meant to signify. Of course, Father Shanley is equipped to deliver an instructive lecture on Aquinas. After 2 decades or 3 decades spent studying him, it would be pathetic if he couldn't. But again, the point of this gathering is not merely academic, so to say, it is celebratory. And what we are celebrating is a life, the life of an institution, of a human community, of our university, that is now 125 years on, itself no mean feat in this age of great tumult and cultural upheaval. But the celebration of a life makes no sense if it is wholly retrospective in outlook, if the life formerly lived is now dead and gone. To celebrate the life of this university is to delight in and be grateful for something ongoing, something with a future, something promising, all the challenges that lie ahead of us notwithstanding, something promising many more years of life to come. It is for this reason I believe that Father Brian Shanley, OP, is the right man for the job. I say that because in him the commitment to study and teaching of Aquinas, and more recently the commitment to fostering by his words and deed the continuance of educational institutions where such study and teaching is still recognized as valuable, nay essential. This commitment is his life. But to say that is not only to describe a zero-sum game, whereby he loses his life and others gain. To the contrary, he shows by the life he has lived and lives that it is really possible to find a life, or get a life, as we now say, by spending it, and in particular by spending it in the company of our patron saint. You will object, but of what relevance is his being a Dominican? I expect he would answer everything, or perhaps almost everything. But of course, that answer can't suffice as an answer for those of us here who are not, and for a university that is not a Dominican Catholic university in America, as is his, but the Catholic University of America, as is ours. To that question, the question I just posed, I would answer that he shows by example that unequivocal religious commitment and penetrating human intelligence need not be hostile, that they really can be lived in such a way as to make for a life, to make for a good life, a life that helps others to live their lives also. And it's very much the same life one finds in the writings of Aquinas, in the writings of Leo XIII, and that God willing, we'll still find for ourselves here for centuries to come. Please welcome our friend, Father Brian Shanley.
I don't know if I'm supposed to thank you for that or not. Was that part of the formula there? Thank you for your introduction, and I promise you my talk will be briefer than his introduction. I am pleased and honored and delighted to be here. I spent 7 years of my life as a grad student in this area, sitting out there on Friday afternoons, and 11 years of my life as a member of the faculty here, sitting there listening to lectures. And this is a place where I learned a lot, and a place that's filled with many happy memories and even a few ghosts. And this is a wonderful occasion for me to be back here. When I was asked to provide a title for this talk, I had no idea of what I was going to say. But I had just read an interesting article in America Magazine by the reigning expert on saints, the Jesuit James Martin, entitled Patrons and Companions. Based on his recent experience of talking to many people about the meaning of the saints, he had come to the conclusion that there were two extreme positions to be avoided. The first was an exaggerated emphasis on the saint as patron, in the sense of a heavenly being who intercedes for us now after having lived a perfect life on earth. The other extreme is an exaggerated emphasis on the saint as companion, in the sense of a flawed and struggling individual who models for us how sanctity can be reflected in ordinary human life and struggle. The latter camp does not want to talk about intercession, apparitions, novenas, and pilgrimages, while the former camp does not want to admit that saints have any flaws. The burden of Martin's article is to argue for some kind of via media, inspired by the old second preface of the Mass for holy men and women, wherein it reads, "They inspire us by their heroic lives," point one about saints, "and help us by their constant prayers." That's the patron side. By the way, the new translation reads, "Their great example lends us courage, and their fervent prayers sustain us in all we do." I don't know who translated that first one. Martin wants us to see the saints as recognizably human beings who do demonstrate how holiness can be manifested in different forms of human lives, just like in the shrine, and who now intercede for us by their prayers in heaven. This strikes me as a sensible approach to the saints, even if it does come from a Jesuit. So I thought, well, I'll just flip the title around. I'll start with companion, then I'll move to patron, and I'll apply it to Thomas Aquinas, and I'll be done. And then I thought about the talk. And the more I reflected on my task, the more I realized that my initial aim and impression needed to be rethought in the light of the peculiar charge that I felt that I had been given. What I was asked to speak about was the meaning of having Thomas Aquinas as the patron saint of the, as Father Pitzel used to say, Catholic University of America on the occasion of this, your 125th anniversary. It's one thing to discuss the role of a saint as a patron for an individual, but it is another to talk about how an individual saint can be thought of both as an exemplar and intercessor, companion and patron of an educational institution. What I want to offer today are some remarks on how Aquinas' example remains fundamentally integral to the mission of the Catholic University of America, and why it is important that he is also its patron in heaven. In making this claim, I mean to suggest that Aquinas' patronage will always be vital to the Catholic University of America, in contradistinction to how the patronage of saints operates in the lives of individuals. For as James Martin narrates in his My Life with the Saints, at different points in our life, we may find ourselves attracted to the patronage of different saints, depending upon where we are in our pilgrimage. While I do not mean to suggest that Thomas Aquinas is the only patron for the Catholic University of America, I do mean to suggest that he is a perennial saint for this university, like Dominic is for a Dominican. And I also think, and this is part of my burden today, that he is peculiarly timely saint for this university, given the contemporary challenges facing Catholic higher education. The inspiration for this talk comes from the text of Aquinas that I believe I taught more often than anything else while I was here at Catholic U, and that is the prologue to the Summa Contra Gentiles. I taught it every time I taught philosophy of religion because it is the primary locus for Aquinas' understanding of the relationship between faith and reason. I also taught graduate courses on Book 1 and Book 3. My primary interest in the prologue is because in this intensely personal work, which Aquinas worked on for 7 years on the side, in order to prove that the Catholic faith was compatible with the legacy of pagan antiquity and above all Aristotle, Aquinas articulates in a striking manner his sense of his own vocation in the church. I want to concentrate on 3 basic themes in the prologue as particularly important for us today. The first 2 themes are more along the lines of how he is an important exemplar, while the third theme moves us from exemplar to patron. And so I will end with why it's important for us to think of Aquinas being our patron in heaven. So, first part. The very first word of the Summa Contra Gentiles is veritatem. Veritatem meditabitur gutur meum, et labia mea destentabantur impium. Proverbs 8:7. For those of you who don't know Latin, my mouth shall meditate on truth, and my tongue shall detest impiety. Truth is so central to Aquinas' aim in this text that the late Dominican René Antoine Gautier, the reigning expert on the text, argued that the manuscript tradition testifies that the more authentic title of this work is Liber de Veritate Catholicae Fide contra Errores Infidelium, the book of the truth of the Catholic faith against the errors of the infidels. Gautier argues that this work is not really a summa or completed treatise, but rather a kind of extended debate with all kinds of non-believers, from pagans, Muslims, and Jews, and the whole heritage of antiquity, about the relationship between the truths of the Catholic faith and the recently introduced works of Aristotle, along with its heavy interpretive apparatus. This is a book dedicated to manifesting the truth of the Catholic faith in dialogue with the patrimony of the past. You may recall that the motto of the Dominican order is Veritas, so it should come as no surprise that truth would be foremost in St. Thomas's mind, nor in my mind. Full disclosure, the motto of Providence College is Veritas. But let me let you in on another reason why I'm starting with truth. In preparing for this lecture, I finally had a chance to read the last published work of my confrere and friend, the late Kurt Pritzel, former dean of the School of Philosophy. It is an edited volume from a fall lecture series devoted to the question of truth. And its title is Truth, Studies in a Robust Presence. I love that title. I hope Kurt gave it that title. I don't know. It begins with the following sentence in Father Pritzel's introduction. Quote, "The nature of truth and the human capacity to have it, to retain it, and to achieve more of it are topics that have preoccupied philosophers at least since the moment when the goddess told Parmenides that she would teach him, quote, all things, both the unshaken heart of well-rounded truth and the opinions of mortals in which there is no reliance," end quote. So I begin with truth as much in homage to Father Pritzel as in fidelity to St. Thomas. And I am delighted to note that the first holder of the chair endowed in Father Pritzel's honor, Professor John Rist, whom I saw in the crowd, is someone who has written a thoughtful book on the question, what is truth? I'm so glad that Professor Rist is the first holder of that chair. One of the most important things that Thomas Aquinas models for Catholic University is a confidence that human beings can indeed reach the unshaken heart of well-rounded truth, and that truth is indeed a robust presence to be contemplated at a Catholic university. I will return to Father Pritzel's contribution on Aristotle shortly, but let me first briefly discuss the essay by Jan Eertsen in that volume entitled Truth in the Middle Ages, Its Essence and Power in Christian Thought. In his introduction to that piece, Ayrton says, quote, "If something has been lost in the philosophy of the last century, it is the conviction of the power and sense of truth." He then quotes Friedrich Nietzsche. "What is new," this is Nietzsche, "in our present attitude toward philosophy is the conviction that up to now no age has ever shared with us, that we are not in possession of the truth. All our predecessors possessed truth, even the skeptics. The skeptics thought skepticism was the truth. The sun of truth has been extinguished. And in the wake of that loss, Nietzsche says, we are by no means sad and dark, but rather delight in a new and indescribable kind of light, bliss, relief, cheerfulness. The joyful science is that there is no truth, and the desire to know it is replaced instead by the will to power and the transvaluation of all values. On most university campuses these days, I dare say, Nietzsche has triumphed, and truth is reduced to perspective, construct, disguised power claim, or pragmatic best up till now theory. Relativism, skepticism, and deflationism has eroded our confidence that there is such a thing as truth in the old-fashioned sense. In a recent New York Times Sunday book review consideration of the reception of Nietzsche in America, entitled American Nietzsche, the author concludes that contemporary American interpreters of Nietzsche concur that, quote, "In a world without foundations, our views of truth, language, and self are not mirrors of reality, but useful fictions to explore new avenues of discovery and new senses of wonder." Wow. In this context, Aquinas' consideration of a quadlibetal question in Advent of 1270 can seem quaint at best. The question posed to Aquinas, and a quadlibetal question was one that the audience would pose for the master, was this: is truth stronger than wine, king, and woman? Now, you may find that a funny question, but there's actually a biblical trope that is the occasion for this. And I'm borrowing from Ayrton here, because I want to make a point that I think he makes pretty well. Okay, wine seems to be the strongest because it changes people strikingly. As anyone who braves a college campus late at night on Fridays and Saturdays can attest, I'm sure that's not true here at the Catholic University of America, but if you walk around my campus on a Friday or Saturday night, you can see how strong wine is. This is corroborated by the ancient dictum, in vino est veritas. So perhaps wine really is stronger than truth. On the other hand, Aquinas observes, a king seems even stronger than wine, since he can coerce a subject to brave death itself. Pardon me if this is offensive to some people. Women, he observes, seem even stronger since they can dominate kings. So, Aquinas resolves the question by saying that because the four things belong to different genuses, they are not comparable according to a single criterion. It's a typical Aquinas way of doing it. Nevertheless, it is possible to compare them insofar, Aquinas observes, as they all concur in a common effect, which he describes as immutatio cordis homini, change in the human heart. Wine changes us at a physical level. The allure of the opposite sex changes us at the level of sensitive appetites. And kings have power over us at the level of practical and political imperatives. But truth is yet stronger, Aquinas argues, because truth engages us at the level of our speculative minds, which is the deepest power of human agency. Therefore, he concludes, truth is more powerful than wine, woman, and king. It is no easy thing to convince a college student that the contemplation of truth is more transformative than drugs, sex, or politics. And I want to come back to this theme of contemplation at the end of my talk. But for now, I want to note that one of the biggest challenges facing Catholic education is getting our students to believe in the possibility of real truth in a cultural and intellectual context that revels in the joyful science of relativism. A confidence in the possibility of the achievement of truth is one of the greatest and most liberating gifts that we can give to our students as something not only to be contemplated, but also lived. Truth is a deep wellspring of hope and optimism about the possibility of leading a life of deep meaning. When Catholics talk about truth, however, especially with a capital T, it makes everybody else nervous, as though we think we have all the answers. So at the same time that we want to inculcate in our students a confidence that we can indeed be agents of truth, as Monsignor Sokolowski says, we need a strong sense of humility about how hard it is to arrive at some truths as an antidote to any hint of triumphalism about truth. And here's where Father Pritzel's Aristotle and Aquinas can help us. Father Pritzel's final published essay is entitled Aristotle's Door. Let me quote the relevant passage from Aristotle that Father Pritzel comments on in that article. Aristotle says, "The investigation of the truth is in one way hard, in another way easy. An indication of this is found in the fact that no one is able to attain the truth adequately, while, on the other hand, no one fails entirely. But everyone says something true about the nature of things. And while individually they contribute little or nothing to truth, by the union of all, a considerable amount is amassed. Therefore, since the truth seems to be like the proverbial door, hence the title, which no one can fail to hit, it is in this way easy. But the fact that we can have a whole truth and not the particular part we aim at shows the difficulty of it." It's the end of Aristotle's quote. I cannot hope to convey, nor is it my purpose, the subtlety and complexity of Father Pritzel's account of the meaning of this text, and I urge you to read his essay. So at the great risk of oversimplifying what he says so much more deeply, let me say that Aristotle believed that the human mind is hardwired to register the forms of the things of this world. We are naturally suited to know the essence of things. But the achievement of genuine scientific knowledge is very difficult. In between the initial noetic grasp of the essence of things and the full articulation of that knowledge into truly scientific knowledge lies, and here's Father Pritzel again, the terrain of partial truth, obscure truth, what is more familiar to us than what is familiar by nature, truth in lesser and greater degrees, and so on. While Father Pritzel did not elaborate on this topic in the article, some of his finest work was on the role of endoxa in Aristotle. The endoxa included the received opinions of the day and the prevailing positions from the past. From a methodological point of view, Aristotle thought that the inquiry into truth was never a wholesale starting over. It was never a Cartesian revolution, but rather a rethinking of what had been thought before in order to arrive at a firmer and more scientific grasp of what is true. Every seriously received opinion must reflect the truth in some fashion, even if it was only partial and obscure and not yet articulated into a scientific whole. Aristotle listened respectfully and sympathetically to both the tradition that preceded him and the opinions of his day. Aquinas imitated Aristotle in the way he likewise sifted through the opinions of the past and the present in his search to articulate what is true. This mode of inquiry into truth seems to me the perennial ideal for a Catholic university, to be a place where there is dialogue with both the tradition handed down from the past and the voices of the present. Aquinas is renowned for being able to formulate positions that he did not hold even better than those who originated them. He had an enormous capacity to see the other side of every question. The discipline of the disputed question, the hearing of one side of the issue, then the other side, then a determinatio, then a refutation of the opposing view, gave Aquinas a capacious and sympathetic mind. It is important to note that in refuting the views of those with whom he did not agree, Aquinas sought to find in them some kind of partial or obscure truth, and to identify precisely where and how that partial truth led them to error. As Alistair MacIntyre has pointed out, in order to show the rational superiority of one tradition over another, it is necessary to show why and how that tradition does and indeed must go wrong, given its assumptions. To be able to find some truth in a view that you do not agree with is a way of finding a possible starting point to lead the other person to a deeper and fuller truth. Here, as an anecdote, one of the founding moments of the Dominican order, maybe the moment when God gave Dominic the inspiration for the order, was the night that he spent all night arguing with an innkeeper in Toulouse on his way on a mission with his bishop. And the innkeeper had fallen under the Cathar heresy. And Dominic spent the whole night arguing with the innkeeper. As one of my Dominican brothers once said, you don't spend the whole night just going, you're a heretic, you're a heretic, you're a heretic. You argue. And you try to find something you can agree upon to get that person to where you want them to go intellectually. And I think that love of argument that St. Thomas had is part of the Dominican charism. I think I'm allowed to be mildly chauvinistic today. As Joseph Pieper once described Aquinas' methodology, and I got this quote from one of Father Pritzel's old papers that I was rereading recently. In every serious utterance by an opponent, some one of the many facets of reality is expressed. There's always something right and truthful in his words. And although this something may be minimal, the refutation must begin there if it is to be convincing. Aquinas is careful to point out in the prologue that in arguing with other people, it's always important to pick out starting point for argument that the other person should be able to accept, either from faith, reason, or both. In arguing with someone who does not agree with you, sometimes you will be able to show that his or her arguments are not true. Sometimes you will be able to show only that the other side hasn't proven its point. When it comes to arguing matters of faith, some truths can only be believed, while others can be argued for. And what you can argue for is sometimes capable of being proved, and sometimes only capable of being shown to be fitting or convenience. Aquinas considers it very important to understand the limits of how the truth can be manifested. I take all these attitudes towards the truth to be desirable traits to be imitated on a Catholic campus. As John Paul II said in Ex Corde Ecclesiae, the mission of a Catholic university is a diaconia of the truth, a service of the truth, because it is to be consecrated to the cause of truth. That's the end of part one. Each part is shorter, too. My second part, starting with truth. The discussion of truth leads me to a second aspect of Aquinas' self-understanding that I consider to be perennially critical to the mission of a Catholic university. Immediately following the quotation from Proverbs 8:7, Aquinas launches into an investigation of the officium sapientis, the office or duty of the wise man. Calling upon Aristotle's treatment of the endoxa or received opinions, Aquinas says those are called wise, quote, who order things rightly and govern them well. He then points out that one can only order or govern well if one knows what the end is, because the achievement of the end is the good for anything. Let me digress from the text for a moment just to say something about the Aristotelian idea of an end. Aristotle's most basic explanatory principle is form. A thing's substantial form determines it to be the kind of thing that it is. Because it is the kind of being that it is, it finds its completion or perfection in certain characteristic activities whereby it flourishes as a member of its kind. And the sustained flourishing of something in a high level of characteristic activity is its proper good. I was with some people last week who had a Springer Spaniel, and I don't know anything about Springer Spaniels, but I learned their telos is flushing birds on hunting trips. So when a Springer Spaniel is out there flushing birds on a hunting trip, it's achieving its telos. Aristotle and Aquinas think that not only do things in general and living things in particular have intrinsic ends, but so do human practices and institutions that go with those practices. Medicine, for example, finds its completion or good in restoring and promoting health. Military strategy finds its completion in defeating an opposing army. Back now to the text. Aquinas notes that there are varying relationships of order that obtain between practices, with some being more architectonic and others being subordinate. The more architectonic an art or practice is, the higher the good. But as one moves higher in the ranks of goods pursued, there is one good that stands above all as that to which everything else is ordered, the universal end of all things. So Aquinas says, quote, "The name of the absolutely wise man, however, is reserved for him whose consideration is directed to the end of the universe, which is also the origin of the universe. And this, of course, is God." Aquinas then goes on to say that the end of each thing is that which is intended by its first mover. Since the first author or creator will be proven, he says, to be an intelligent being, the ultimate good of the universe must be the good proper to intellect, which is the achievement of truth. Hence, Aquinas concludes, truth must consequently be the ultimate end of the whole universe, and the consideration of the wise man aims principally at truth. This intrinsic connection between truth and wisdom. In the second chapter of the work, Aquinas explains his intention by extolling the virtues of wisdom, and I will come back to those virtues in my final section. For now, I want to note a passage that I take to be as autobiographical as anything in the works of Aquinas. And here's Aquinas, and I think he is describing his vocation. "And so, in the name of the divine mercy, I have the confidence to embark upon the work of a wise man, even though this may surpass my powers. And I have set myself the task of making known, as far as my limited powers will allow, the truth that the Catholic faith professes, and of setting aside the errors that are opposed to it. To use the words of Hilary, I am aware that I owe this to God as the chief duty of my life, that my every word and sense may speak of him." Here I'll claim another Dominican inspiration. St. Dominic was described as talking always either to God or about God, and Aquinas was the same. So the Summa Contra Gentiles is a book not only about truth, but also of wisdom. The pursuit of truth eventuates in an integrated view of the whole of the universe, wherein everything is ordered to God as the ultimate good. And it is the task of the wise man to make known by speech and words to others the truth about God and the world's relationship to God. One of the other mottos of the Dominican order, besides veritas, is contemplata et aliis tradere. In arguing for the superiority of the Dominican mix of contemplation and preaching, had to get that in, Aquinas says that to contemplate and to share with others the fruits of contemplation is better than contemplation alone. If there are any monks out there, that's you. Contemplation is ordered to the apostolic task of sharing truth with others. It is important to note that Aquinas' sense of wisdom here, and I can't get into it, is not the same as Aristotle's, even though he borrows heavily from Aristotle. He makes it clear that his sense of wisdom is Aristotelian and Pauline and Augustine and Christ-centered, back to my homily yesterday. Quote, Aquinas, divine wisdom testifies that he has assumed flesh and come into the world in order to make the truth known. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, that I should give testimony to the truth. Aquinas' sense of wisdom is an ordered whole, with theology as the architectonic discipline, philosophy as its handmaid, and all the other sciences playing a subordinate role. We live in a world today that, because it does not believe in truth, a fortiori, it does not believe in the possibility of wisdom. This has important ramifications for the idea of a university. As Alistair MacIntyre has observed, what the Catholic faith, this is a quote from MacIntyre, what the Catholic faith confronts today in American higher education, and indeed in American education more generally, is not primarily some range of alternative beliefs about the order of things, but rather a belief that there is no such thing as the order of things, of which there could be a unified, if complex, understanding, or even a movement towards such an understanding. There is, on the contemporary view, nothing to understanding except what is supplied by the specialized and professionalized disciplines and subdisciplines and sub-subdisciplines. Higher education has become a set of assorted and heterogeneous specialized inquiries into a set of assorted and heterogeneous subject matters. All explanation is in consequence treated as if context-bound and as if there is no such thing as an integrated and integrative understanding, end quote from MacIntyre. MacIntyre describes this as the fragmentation of the university. Before I discuss further this idea of the contemporary fragmentation of the university, I want us to recall that in Aquinas' own day, there was a real danger that the 13th century university would fragment, precisely over the question of the relationship between Aristotelian thought and Catholic truth. Following the lead of his mentor, Albert the Great, Thomas's life project was to show that when properly understood, the philosophical truths of Aristotle were not in fundamental opposition to the truths of the Catholic faith, but rather in harmony with them. Not everyone at the University of Paris saw things that way. There was a group of masters in the Faculty of Arts, most notably Caesar of Brabant and Boethius of Dacia, who argued that Aristotle's philosophy concluded to positions at odds with the Catholic faith on such key questions as the eternity of the world, whether or not every human being has an intellective soul, and the nature of happiness. At one time, this movement was described as Latin Averroism because it relied heavily on the interpretive work of Averroes, known to the medievals as the commentator. But a better term of art is radical Aristotelianism. At least that's what I was taught at the Catholic University of America by Monsignor Whipple. What was radical about this Aristotelianism was precisely its willingness to interpret Aristotle as concluding demonstratively to positions that were opposed to the truths professed by the Catholic faith. At one time, this position was described as holding that there were two truths, one the deliverance of faith, the other the deliverance of Aristotelian philosophy. One of the things I learned is nobody ever actually held that position, but many people thought that was the implication of the position. All a radical Aristotelian could do when you concluded philosophically is kind of shrug your shoulders, because they didn't want to say that it contradicts the church, but there it is. Aristotle says this, the church says this, we can't figure out how they go together. If philosophical reason concluded to something at odds with faith, then the faculty of arts and the faculty of theology could not be harmonized, and the unity of the university would be destroyed because the unity of truth could not be maintained. St. Thomas fought the fight to defend the harmony of Aristotle with the truths of the Catholic faith, and thus the unity of the university, with every fiber of his being during his second sojourn to Paris. In arguing against the radical Aristotelians, Aquinas got unusually heated. He usually never loses his cool. This is most clearly seen in the conclusion of his De Unitate Intellectus, a text that I first studied on Monsignor Whipple's guidance while a grad student here at Catholic University. I think it was the De Anima in Medieval Philosophy was the name of the course. In that work, Aquinas argues that a proper interpretation of Aristotle's teaching on soul is that there is not just one intellective soul that we all share in, but rather each human soul has its own proper intellect. After laying out his argument, Aquinas says in the concluding paragraph, quote, "This, therefore, is what we have written to destroy the aforesaid error, not by means of the teachings of faith, but by means of arguments and words of the philosophers themselves. But if there be anyone boasting of his knowledge, falsely so called, who wishes to say something against what we have written here, let him not speak about it in corners, nor in the presence of boys who do not know how to judge about such difficult matters. But let him write against this treatise if he dares. And he will find not only me, who am the least of others, but many other lovers of truth, by whom his error will be opposed and his ignorance remedied." That's about as smackdown as Aquinas ever gets. Aquinas' passionate defense of the unity of truth finds an echo in Cardinal Newman's famously expressed conviction that at the core of the idea of a Catholic university is the belief that it is possible to show how all truths fit together into a single whole. Quote, you've heard this, I think President Garvey quoted this, every Catholic president is obliged to quote Newman at least once in every talk, so I'm going to get it out of the way here. Here's what Newman says, I remind you. "That only is true enlargement of the mind, which is the power of viewing many things at once as one whole, of referring them severally to their true place in the universal system, of understanding their respective values and determining their mutual dependence. Possessed of this real illumination, the mind never views any part of the extended subject matter of knowledge without recollecting that it is but a part." End quote. In Ex Corde Ecclesiae, the late John Paul II described a Catholic university as a place where, quote, "scholars will be engaged in a constant effort to determine the relative place and meaning of each of the various disciplines within the context of a vision of the human person and the world." End quote. I wonder where he got that quote. It is the peculiar telos, or end, of a Catholic university to maintain the unity of the university in the face of the growing secular trend of the fragmented university, where students are exposed to a wide variety of views and exhorted to be what Nietzsche called the artists of their own lives. They need a coherent curriculum, which integrates the study of a specialized competency or major into a broader view of the whole, that finds its inspiration in theology and philosophy courses that are truly architectonic and sapiential. They need professors who can and will think beyond the confines of their disciplines to help students connect what they are learning in a discipline to the larger questions of meaning, purpose, order, and God. Aquinas might have been the last thinker who could be considered to have mastered all the most important disciplines of knowledge, but it is not too much to ask of contemporary professors to strain against the limitations of their own disciplines with their reductivist tendencies and help students to achieve that enlargement of mind that is viewing things as a whole. It is precisely to that end that Aquinas remains what John Paul II described as a master of thought, insofar as he was able to integrate faith and reason, science and philosophy, into a single whole that provided a coherent view of the order of all things to God and the unity of truth. The goal of a Catholic university education should be the pursuit of wisdom, and we should not be embarrassed by that claim. In a world where human identity is in danger of being reduced to social or commercial value, and the role of education is correlatively rethought in terms of marketplace or instrumental value, it is a prophetic message to assert that the intrinsic ultimate goal of an education is the achievement of contemplative wisdom. And when we educate our students to be contemplatives, we are also educating them to make good choices. It is not possible to make choices about particular goods apart from a knowledge of the end of the whole. Now I'm moving to my third and final topic, and I have a little bit of a conclusion. I'm on page 15 of 19 for those of you nervous about how long this is going to be. The idea of wisdom is essentially connected with beatitude in the thought of St. Thomas. We become happy or fulfilled by contemplating truth. At the beginning of the second chapter of the Summa Contra Gentiles, Aquinas mounts a series of arguments about the superior value of the pursuit of wisdom. First, he argues that the pursuit of wisdom is more perfect than any other practice because it means that, quote, even now we have some share in true beatitude. Aquinas believes that the telos of human life is the vision of God, and that that vision is inchoate in us when we begin a life of faith. Faith is the beginning of sharing in God's own knowledge of himself. And when that sharing is expanded in the study of theology and the life of grace, we are drawn into a deeper participation in God's own beatitude. One implication of this, not usually noted in their promotional materials, is that a Catholic university is a place where young men and women begin to share in the beatifying vision of God that is eternal life. In an environment where more and more students and parents act like consumers looking for value and ROI, return on investment, I think the Catholic universities need to remind everyone that the main purpose of an education is not to get a job, but to deepen a contemplative vision of God that will one day culminate in heaven. Catholic higher education institutions have their deepest purpose in preparing people for heaven, not the workforce. Of course, parents get nervous when I talk like this. Of course, we want to prepare students for work, because work is part of a meaningful life. But we were not created for work, read Genesis, but rather for communion with God. We educators live in a world of outcomes assessment. Boy, am I sick of that word. Where everyone wants you to prove that you do what you say you do. And for us, the ultimate outcomes assessment is really hidden with God. Aquinas then goes on to argue that wisdom is more noble than anything else because through this pursuit, we approach to a likeness of God. It would be impossible to overstate the importance in Aquinas' thought of the idea that we are created in the image and likeness of God. The entire second part of the Summa is prefaced by the phrase, quia homo factus est ad imaginem Dei dicitur, because man is said to be made in the image and likeness of God. I once wrote a piece on Aquinas' Exemplar ethics, arguing for the centrality of Imago Dei to his moral thought. Here, I want to stress the conceptual connection in Aquinas' thought between beatitude and likeness. One seminal biblical text for Aquinas that governs the entire treatment of the beatific vision in question 13 of the Prima Pars is from the first letter of St. John. Dearly beloved, we are God's children now. What we shall later be has not yet come to light. We know that when it comes to light, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. The beatifying vision of God is the perfection of the likeness to God that begins even now in the life of grace. This, too, we need to offer to our students, the conviction that their vocation is to grow in the image and likeness of God. Aquinas then goes on to say that this communion with God, that is wisdom, joins us to God in friendship. In order to appreciate the audacity of this claim, let me recall for you that in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle denies that it is possible for human beings to be friends with the gods because there is too much of an ontological gap between them. It's in that same section of the Ethics Aristotle explains to students that you cannot adequately repay your philosophy professors for what they have taught you, and I always point that out too. In Aquinas' treatise on charity, he notes that it is precisely because God elevates us in sharing the divine life with us that we can enter into friendship with God. He notes that because of this, not only do we love God, but we enter into a kind of interpersonal reciprocity or mutual sharing that is characteristic of friendship. Aquinas notes that this intimacy, which he describes as familiar conversation, begins in this life by grace and is perfected in the beatific vision. The most important friend that we can teach our student to love cannot be friended on Facebook, but rather only in prayer. And this is something we need to remind our students as well. Aquinas next argues that the pursuit of wisdom is most useful because through it we arrive at the kingdom of immortality. The desire of wisdom bringeth to the everlasting kingdom. Wisdom is the beginning of eternal life, which relativizes all our other pursuits. And our ultimate goal is not to get a job, but to arrive in heaven. The final argument for the value of wisdom is that it is full of joy. Her conversation hath no bitterness, nor her company any tediousness, but joy and gladness. The connection with wisdom, or between wisdom and joy, reminds me of one of my favorite quotes from Simone Weil. Quote, "Intelligence can only be led by desire. In order that there be desire, there must be pleasure and joy. Intelligence only grows and bears fruit in joy. The joy of learning is as indispensable to study as breathing is to running." I love that line. "Where it is absent, there are no students, but only poor caricatures of apprentices who at the end of their apprenticeship do not even have a craft." St. Thomas had a joy of learning and teaching that was infectious for his students. In our hymn to St. Dominic, we speak of the joy of St. Dominic. And the pursuit of wisdom at a Catholic university should be joyful. Joy is one of the gifts that needs to be at the heart of a university. I have now, here's the concluding peroration or whatever, I have now got us as close to heaven as I can in these final remarks about the connection between wisdom and beatitude. So let me now turn at last to my final topic. Why it is important that Aquinas is not only our exemplar, but also our patron in heaven. To understand what this ultimately means, I want to recall that one of the schools of thought that Aquinas tried to combat was called occasionalism, which, when simplified, might be identified as the doctrine that only God is the cause of anything. Everything else that looks like a cause is actually only the occasion for God doing the real causing. Another way of putting this doctrine is to say that if God is to be the cause of all things, then God must be the only real cause of all things. Aquinas' refutation of this position involves the claim that God can be the ultimate cause of all things without being the only cause of all things. While God is the primary cause of all things, there are genuine created causes that generate effects as secondary causes. In his doctrine of divine providence, Aquinas allows for free human causation to play a significant role. We freely choose our own destiny at the same time that God's grace moves us to that good. Aquinas thinks that not only is our own salvation dependent on our free choices, but that we can play a role in God's providence for others through our freely and grace-inspired prayers. When we utter a petitionary prayer for someone else, we are not informing God of what God does not know or asking God for a gift that God does not want to give. Petitionary prayer is neither informative nor coercive. It is rather the case that God's providence allows for our prayers for others to be the instruments of providence, so that we are co-causes with God of the good that comes to others through our prayers. It is a part of the largesse of the grace of God that God allows us to cooperate with him in his providence for others. God lets us be a part of his care for others. This relationship of cooperation and care transcends death itself and brings us into the communion of the saints. The prayers of the saints in heaven remain a part of the providence of God. As the revised preface that I cited at the beginning says, their fervent prayers sustain us in all we do. They sustain us not because God would not otherwise, but because God chooses to do so through their prayers. The patronage of Thomas Aquinas remains for the Catholic University of America a companion whose virtues are to be imitated and sustained. At the same time, he remains its powerful patron intercessor. We need him as both companion and patron. And I like to think that alongside St. Thomas, there is another Dominican companion, Kurt Pritzl, whose example and prayers are part of the providence of God for us as well. Following the advice of James Martin, I would be the last person to describe Father Pritzl as either without fault or deeply flawed. And I won't go into either at the present. But there was holiness there and goodness, to be sure. He was what Martin describes as a healthier model of both patron and companion. The manifestly human being whose earthly life shows us that being a saint means being who you are, but who now enjoys life in heaven and intercedes for us. May both Thomas Aquinas and Father Pritzl pray for the Catholic University of America. Thank you for your attention.
First thing that comes to mind, and I, as I said, there are lots of ghosts in this place for me, and I mean that in a good sense, people who've had a tremendous influence on me here. One of them was Bill Hill, who taught for many years here at the Catholic University of America. And I have a great reverence for Bill Hill as a thinker and as a Dominican, and was privileged to live a long time with Bill in close proximity. And precisely the challenge that you articulated of being firmly grounded in the tradition, and especially in the thought of St. Thomas, and being able to bring that thought to bear in dialogue with Moltmann, with Rahner, and von Balthasar, and contemporary theology, was an extraordinary gift that Bill had. And I once gave a paper about Bill at a conference in his honor, and I described his thought as what I called open Thomism. Thomism that was open to dialogue with contemporary thought, as opposed to the kind of Thomism that says, well, Aquinas got it all right here, you just need to read this. And that capacity of having that foot firmly planted in the past and engaged in the dialogue with the present that someone like Bill Hill models is what I would see as the ideal. But, and this goes to part of your question, and I think this is a challenge for theology today, is that Bill was educated in the old school way where he had to study philosophy for a long period of time before he did speculative theology, so that his speculative theology was informed with an incredible philosophical mind. And you don't have people like that anymore. So that the need that I think the church really does have, and which is why philosophy has been emphasized more and more in the last couple of decades, is that, as Lonergan once famously observed, anybody who thinks they can do theology without philosophy is only going to do bad theology. Now, that's a paraphrase of what Lonergan said, and I don't know whether he really said it, but I always liked it as a quote. So I think that capacity for philosophical insight at the service of the faith is something that the church very much needs, and is something that I like to think is what is being offered at the Catholic University of America. So your point is well taken. And the other point that I'll make, to come back to curricular issues, because we have had these discussions, it's very hard to have sapiential courses in philosophy and theology for students that don't even know the basics of either discipline. So the challenge is always, how do you do more than just service courses and really get our students to be able to think in some way that's informed by sapiential philosophy and theology about the big questions, is a challenge. And it's not an easy one to face on any campus. I wish I had some easy remedy for this, but I don't. But I think this campus's insistence on those 4 theology and the 4 philosophy, which I think you still do here, right? I think that's pretty critical for a Catholic education. Yes.
Ryan, in your summary of Thomas Aquinas' view of the relation between philosophy and theology, both the expression handmade.
I use that term. Yeah, he doesn't use that term.
Well, since you use it, I'll ask you this. In Peter the Ratio, John Paul II remarks pointedly that term is no longer an appropriate way of describing that relationship between philosophy and theology. Could you comment on that remark?
Yeah, I mean, I think philosophy has its own integrity apart from the theological enterprise, and its own sapiential quality, particularly in metaphysics. And so that it's not, in its own telos, is not necessarily order to theology, but I would maintain still that theology does need philosophy, and that for theology, I don't know what the right word, call helper maybe, whatever the right term is, there is a subordinate role that philosophy has in the light of Sacra Doctrina. So there is a way in which what looks from, let's say, the philosophical point of view as an articulated whole is subsumed into something beyond the grasp of philosophy. So I think there are different ways of parsing it, but handmade is probably the wrong word to use, and I think it's not even in my text. It just slipped out, which is Freudian, maybe. The question was if the claim I made is Aquinas always tries really hard to find some shard of truth in the view of an opponent. What would he make of Nietzsche? We're rephrasing. What partial or obscure truth could you build upon with Nietzsche? And doesn't believe in truth. It's funny, I interview candidates for faculty positions at Providence College, and I was interviewing a chemist the other day who, in his mission statement, said something about science teaches you that there is no truth. There's just theories and that sort of thing. So I said to him, do you really believe that? Do you really believe there's no such thing as truth? And he started talking about how theories are never verifiable, they're only falsifiable. I said, okay, that may be true about scientific theories, but about particular kind of bare scientific facts, don't you think these things are true? He said, well, yeah, I do. I said, okay, I just needed to establish that. You do think that there are some things that are true, even though scientific theories, and there are colleagues in this room that know much more about this than I do, you can argue about to what degree they're provable. So with someone like Nietzsche, I think one of the things Aquinas would say, I shouldn't say that. One thing you might say, because Aquinas would be much smarter about this than I would be, is Nietzsche is the one who says the emperor has no clothes on. And in a sense, you could look at Nietzsche and go, Nietzsche has exposed a certain tendency of modernity that eventuates in there is no truth. And to that degree that he offers something of a diagnosis, if you will, of what's gone wrong with modernity, you can say that's why Nietzsche had to say what he had to say. And where Aquinas would go from there, I don't know, but I like that as a first move. So that's about all you're going to get out of me on that one this afternoon.
Well,
yes, back there. Monsignor Whipple has 2 articles on truth, I believe. And I did happen to reread some of that stuff. I mean, I could give you the Thomistic answer about adequatio and things like that. And I do believe that the human mind in registering truth, in a sense, comes to, although I don't hold for a correspondence theory of truth, there's a way in which you get your mind the way that the world is, that there's some kind of a fit between the two. I also think truth is an analogical notion. If you ask me what truth is, I'll say Jesus is truth in one sense. I think certain beliefs can be true, although I can't prove them like I can prove other things. So truth itself is notoriously difficult to define. And I do think it means lots of different things, but at the base of it, I would hold to some version of Aquinas' theory of truth, that there is a kind of adequatio, if you will, of the mind to reality in the registration of truth. But I'll let Monsignor Whipple defend that one. Where are you, Monsignor Whipple, in case you want to weigh in on this? So yeah, it is a tough question. That's why Professor Riss wrote the book, What is Truth? It's a cynical question in Pilate, but it's a tough philosophical question. Yes. Well, you had 2 questions there. The first is that when you're arguing with somebody that you don't agree with, and you find that starting point of the argument, okay, can we agree on this? Okay. And then you want to get that person from, if this truth is laid down as true, this implies this, right? Okay. And then, as you aptly describe it, sometimes people see they're getting led where they don't want to go by the logos, by the argument itself. And at this point, they can shut down. It's like, don't want to go there, you can do the ad hominems or whatever it is you do. Depending on how rational the person is, you can dislodge them. Or sometimes, to be honest with you, sometimes I think just to get them the first couple of steps, even if they balk on the 3rd or the 4th, that might be enough for now. Because with a lot of people, you got to do this, in my opinion, pastorally, slowly. So, okay, well, we don't need to go any farther today, because you got to get used to the fact that you now see this. And then maybe the next time you can get somebody a little bit further. Take that for what it's worth. On the other side, when you realize that you can't explain something that you think is true, what does that do to you psychologically? For me, it makes me think I need to read another book or talk to somebody smarter than me. It doesn't make me think, well, maybe it's not true because I just can't see it. I know that a lot of smart people know things that I don't know. And I think that's the beauty of education, actually, is when you, I find, what I say, my standard speech about education is, education makes you confident that you can learn what you need to learn when you need to learn it. And that if you're well educated and you come up with something you don't know, you figure out a way to find the answer to the question. And the beauty of being on a campus like this is that there's somebody here who has the answer. So if you get stumped, there's plenty of people in this room that can help you out. That's the beauty of the university. Yes. There's an awful lot in Aquinas on love. Dominicans like me tend to privilege intellect over will. And I was dead set on doing something about truth down here. So I went that way for lots of different reasons. But Aquinas, he has, and Dr. White and Dr. Hoffman and who else am I thinking? There's several people here. Dr. Gallagher, my old colleague, has written well on love and Aquinas. So yes, there is a lot of stuff on love and Aquinas. But in that medieval debate over which has priority, intellect or will, Aquinas is an intellect guy. And the Franciscans in the room can defend the opposite point of view. But you're right, that is lacking from my presentation, but could be there if I had another hour. I might be able to have worked that one in. Somehow I knew you were going there when this thing started. And The problem of, and I think I've read this in some of your work, of the divided self that we experience inside of us that is so beautifully articulated in the Confessions of St Augustine, the good that I would, I do not will. And I agree with you that I don't think MacIntyre grapples enough with the tension between Augustinianism and Aristotelianism in Aquinas. So I agree with you. And this is the neuralgic point of that. And Dr. McKay and I were talking about the possibility of natural virtue last night over a beer, which is one of her areas of expertise, and she can weigh in on this if she wants as well. To what degree are we perfectible, and what does that mean? I did argue once in a paper on Aquinas that there was such a thing as pagan virtue. And it's a debated point in Aquinas whether Aquinas thinks that man apart from grace is capable of moral integration, and if so, what kind? And what is the relationship of that moral integration, those putative virtues, with grace? And I actually think Aquinas works it out pretty well, but as we were discussing last night, you wish he'd said more about some of these points, and there's still a lot to wrestle with. So yes, when it comes to reconciling traditions, the effect of the fall on human nature and the, if you will, debilitated capacity that human beings have for moral integration is something that Aquinas really struggles, that Augustinian idea, with his Aristotelian intuitions about human nature. So I agree with you, there is a tension there. I don't think MacIntyre's grapple with it. I think you can work it out in Aquinas, but I think there's a lot of room for argument there as well. I do know, I've had to read a lot of literature on what's the difference between multidisciplinary courses, interdisciplinary courses, one discipline after another courses, and things like that. And when you read someone like MacIntyre and many others, and you see this more and more when I sit and I interview people for opening faculty positions, is that the role of education, by the time you get to the PhD, you know a lot about this. And you're really comfortable there. And there's a way in which, especially if you go teach in a non-research university, if you go to a research university, you can stay in your sweet spot a lot easier than you can on a liberal arts campus, where your knowledge of the metaphysical poetry of John Donne, you don't get to teach that. So you have to teach students that have different interests, and it's almost like you need to be willing to go back and kind of maybe relearn stuff you used to know and learn some things that you didn't know. But I think the big challenge is that if all you do is talk to the people, and this is one of the reasons why I think it's great that philosophy is back on this side of the street. I loved Bonaventure Hall, but we could stay in Bonaventure Hall and talk to each other because we all love talking to each other, but we were in a little world. It's great that philosophy is back in the middle of the campus because I think it facilitates dialogue. It was one of the things that here on this campus I always liked about teaching the honors program, is it got me out of talking to just people who did what I did. At Providence College, we have an interdisciplinary course in the development of Western Civ, where philosophy professors, literature professors, history professors, and what am I missing? History, anyway, they have to talk to each other because they have to teach with each other. And I always found that enormously stimulating when I was able to do that. I love reading Homer, and I love listening to a colleague talk about Homer or talk about history. So that developing interdisciplinary courses is something that a campus can do to get people to think outside of the box. So that it is hard, because as MacIntyre puts it, you get into the discipline, and what you do for most of our students, they tick off the stuff that they have to take. Our students, for example, wait until senior year to take their science requirement because they're convinced that there's only like 3 courses that are actually worth taking. So they've forgotten everything they learned about science in high school, and then they take it because they don't want to have to think scientifically. So getting them to see, we have to design science courses that have hooks on them, like CSI or something like that, for people to learn about a discipline that they don't care about, because they don't know it's important to understand how science works. So I think, in all of the disciplines, it's really hard to create environments where professors and students together are forced to think outside of their boxes and how those boxes go together. But I think it can be done. I think it happens on this campus. I know it did for me, but it's something you have to be conscious of because the inertia is towards, I'm going to stay in my discipline where I'm really good. And I've been right-handed for a while. I'm going to look at the left-hand side of the room. I would guess, like my school, that Catholic U probably has a ton of kids that are doing work in local schools, education majors, campus ministry, or whatever. And I, especially in an urban environment, it's so important to get urban kids actually to even get on a campus of a university and begin to see themselves as, this is what I want to do, this is what I want to be. So in bridging the gap between local schools and the university, both by going out and by bringing in, I think that's very important. I think that being a place where one of the great debates of our day, which is really contentious, is what's the best way to educate in elementary school, junior high school, and high school. And I think Catholic universities have a very important role to play in that debate. So I think there is a theoretical component that we can add to the mix about the current debates that we have about what's the best way to educate people. And I also think it's by, I think one of the challenges we all face at every school is, to what degree do you just accept this is where students are when they get there and you're just going to have to live with that? To what degree do you hold up standards and say, you know what, we're not taking kids from your school because they don't do well here. Is that going to help that school get better? Or do you shrug your shoulders and say that's just where they are? And that's, I don't know the answer to that question. I think that's a difficult thing to negotiate, actually.
Well, I think I often watch with delight Father Shanley with Father Pritzel, and partly I learned from them how important it is to insult your friends, and so that was the spirit in which I began. But I wanted to end with something that he lived in the last years of his life with astonishing radiance, gratitude to you for your friendship and coming down here and over the years. So first thing, thank you, Father Shanley. Secondly, we are going to have an outcome evaluation of the lecture, and there'll be forms to fill out, and on a 1 to 5 scale, you be honest, and it's anonymous. And then thirdly, once that's done, you can join us for a reception, and I hope you will. Thank you.